Section 11 of Alexander the Great by Ada Russell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 11. The Return to Susa, 326 through 324 B.C. The Alexandrian Empire was now sketched out as far as extent went, and Alexander turned his marvelous energies for the short remaining portion of his life to its organization, although vast schemes of commercial expansion and geographical discovery were on the stocks when he died. The cities he established were from the first as much trading centers as garrisons, and were probably intended by him to be so. When he finally returned to Pella, if he ever intended to return to that unattractive spot after seeing so many wonderful cities, the richest of the East were to roll naturally into Macedonia through the conduits he was laying down. Western commerce with India was for the first time to be possible, and Alexander was about to make a determined effort to circumnavigate Africa when he died. His decision to avoid wearisome land marches for his army by sea voyages must have led in itself to the acquirement of new geographical knowledge. He was also building a fleet for exploration of the Caspian. By the side of schemes like these, the picture of his ignorant soldiers struggling along under the sacks of booty which were, to them, all that war meant, is a pitiable one. But king and common soldier fared much the same in the long run. The king passed away with all his schemes unfinished, and the men either lost their booty on the way or perished before arriving home with it. Porus was made viceroy of the country as far as the Ephesus. The Hydrotes and Essenes were recrossed by the army, rejoicing in the thought that in a few months' time all their labors would be over, and they might settle down as rich and famous men for life. On the shore of the Essenes, Conus fell ill and died, and the monarch, who buried him magnificently in his usual way, could not refrain from saying that the return toward Macedonia for which Conus had pleaded had not done him much good. Nor did Alexander intend the army to march home by the quickest route. Besides dragging part of the force through the wilds of Gedrosia, it is thought that he meant to lead the army home to Macedonia via Syria, Egypt, Africa, Spain, and Italy, and there were signs that for himself he intended to make Susa his permanent capital. At the Hydaspes, Alexander stayed some time to superintend affairs at his two new cities and prepare for the heroic expedition which was to prove one of the heaviest labors of the long-suffering army. Men of his time speculated, as modern men have speculated, about the sources of the Nile, and Alexander must have thought that river of extraordinary extent, as he at first imagined that the Indus was the same stream. The natives, however, told him that the Hydaspes and Essenes united and joined the Indus, which then flowed southward and formed a delta at its issue into the ocean. He also learned for the first time that by traversing this ocean westward, keeping near the coast, vessels would arrive at the mouths of the Euphrates and Tigris, which did not unite at that time, whence it was a short march to Susa. The king had never seen the ocean, and like every other Greek had heard plentiful stories of its perils, the chief of which were its supernatural horrors. Nevertheless, there opened before his mind's eye the vast possibilities of ocean travel, and he caused this new route to be explored. The whole army went southward toward the ocean, down the Hydaspes and on its banks. With its barbarian accretions, it was now a huge force. Craterus rode along the right bank of the stream at the head of one contingent, Hephaestion on the left bank at the head of another with 200 elephants, while the fleet, amounting to nearly 2,000 craft, was under Nearchus. Onesicrates, who wrote an unreliable account of the king's travels, being pilot of the royal ship. At the approach of dawn on an October day in 326 B.C., as the last troops were embarking, Alexander offered sacrifices to the rivers Hydaspes, Essenes, and Indus, to Poseidon, Amphitrite, the Nereids, and Ocean, as well as to Zeus Amnon and Heracles. When he had embarked, he poured out a libation to the river deities from a golden goblet, and ordered the signal for starting seaward to be given by the trumpet. The Indians accompanied the army for a considerable distance along the banks of the stream, dancing and singing their native songs. The cries of the boatswains and the splash of the oars reverberated long after the last Macedonian boat had passed out of sight down the river. At the juncture of the Hydaspes with the Aeneas, several vessels were wrecked by the roaring, dashing waves, and Alexander might have felt that he had fought with these streams as Achilles had striven with the Scamander. When the fleet had again reached calm water, the king went on an inland expedition against the Malians and nearly lost his life in a moment of reckless valor. He marched 60 miles through waterless country, captured the chief city, and slaughtered all the inhabitants, while Perdiccas took another town from which the barbarians had fled. Then, chasing the fugitives before them, the soldiers sped on to the Hierotis, forded it, and rushed onward, slaying till they came to a stronghold of the Brahmins and drove its defenders from their walls. As the Indians withdrew into their citadel, a few Macedonians rushed in with them, but fought their way out again. Alexander then brought up his siege engines and ordered scaling ladders to be placed against the walls of the citadel. He himself was the first man to leap down among the enemy. The soldiers quickly followed, and nearly the entire body of defenders, about 5,000, were slain. Other sieges and battles followed. In one day, Alexander, again the first to mount a scaling ladder when besieging a Malian stronghold, was left alone with Fucestus, Abrahas, and Leonatus, through the ladder breaking with the weight of climbers beneath. Aloft in his glittering armor, a mark for every missile, there seemed to be only one thing for the king to do, and that was to slip down among his friends as they called him to do. Instead, he leaped suddenly down over the wall into the hostile city. It was magnificent, but was it war? It seems almost impertinent to put such a question to such a warrior, but his army did not hesitate to ask it when they had got him safely out again. They seem, indeed, to have feared that he had become indifferent to life, for in their remonstrance they laid the greatest stress on his responsibilities. Meanwhile, like some mythical Norse hero, Alexander was fighting below, single-handed against a host. A tree, as he had no doubt calculated before leaping down, gave him a certain amount of cover. The Indians thronged round him, eager to dispatch the dragon that had devoured Asia, but he slew those who approached. They were forced to draw back, and from a distance threw missiles. Thus he stood with his back to the wall, surrounded by a little heap of corpses, when the three who had climbed up behind him sprang down to his assistance. Abrahas was instantly transfixed by an arrow and fell dead, and Alexander was now pierced through the breastplate. He fought on, though dizzy with loss of blood, until he fell swooning over his shield. Then Peocestus leaped in front of him, holding him over the sacred shield brought from Troy, while Leonatus guarded him on the other side. Both were wounded, and still no help came. The Macedonians outside were so eager to get up to help their king that all the ladders were broken, and they only mounted in the end by driving pegs into the wall or climbing in stages on each other's shoulders. When at last they leaped down on the inside, a loud cry of lamentation rose, for they saw their king lying on the ground as though dying. A desperate conflict followed around his fallen body, till the city gate was forced and the whole body of soldiery poured into the town. While some bore off the king on his shield, others turned to the congenial work of revenge, and not a man, woman, or child in that city escaped death. When the arrow was removed from the king's wound, after an operation borne with Spartan fortitude, he bled copiously and swooned again, and it was some time before he was sufficiently recovered to return to his fleet and army at the juncture of the Hierotis and the Aeneas, where Nearchus and Hephaestion exercised their respective rules. A report had been carried that he was dead, and after the first lamentations for their beloved leader, these soldiers were struck with fear and contemplating their own position without Alexander in the midst of hostile nations. There was no one of Alexander's generals whom they thought for a moment of comparing with the king, and they may have shrewdly guessed that men like Hephaestion and Craterus, already bitter rivals, would have gone to war with each other rather than have accepted the other's superiority. Their direst forebodings at this time were fulfilled less than 3 years later, when Alexander actually died. A letter from the king arrived at the camp, but it was believed to be a forgery, and Alexander, hearing of all that was going on, and fearing a revolution, rose from his sickbed. He was carried to the Hydrotis and placed in a boat. The oars were muffled, as he was too ill to bear their noise, and the usual cries of the boatmen were silenced in the long, slow journey down the Hydrotis to the Assinas. As he approached the camp, the tent covering was removed so that the army might see the sick king with its own eyes. But the soldiers were incredulous, believing that Alexander's corpse was being brought to them, until they saw his hand feebly waving. Then a great cheer rose from the crowd, and many wept. A litter was brought, but ill as he was, Alexander was lifted onto a horse and rode amid shouts of joy toward his tent. At the entrance he dismounted, so that he might be seen walking, and the men crowded round him. Some touched his hands or knees or clothes to be quite sure that he was really there and alive, while others threw the garlands and flowers of India. Afterward, severely chidden for his wanton recklessness, an old Boeotian replied for him, to the tune set by both Alexander and his father, in a line from Aeschylus: "Who does must suffer." Neighboring nations, including the Malians, now sent in their submission. Sailing down the Assinis to its junction with the Indus, Alexander there founded another great city of Alexandria, with a large dockyard, and created a new province stretching from this point to the coast. Another Alexandria with another dockyard was founded as he sailed down the Indus to the sea. He sent Craterus with the worn-out soldiers to march back to Persis by the Bolan Pass and Sistan, and then spent some time in reducing the cities and sovereigns of Sind, again coming into conflict with the Brahmins, whom he learned to respect as deep philosophers. The scanty reports indicate a fierce resistance. Cities were razed to the ground, and their inhabitants sold into slavery. At Patala, the ancient capital of Lower Sind, near the apex of the Indus Delta, Alexander established a third great city with harbor and dockyards, for he had made a correct estimate of the wealth and importance of India. It is almost certain that he would have organized permanent trading relations between this country and the West, although he would perhaps never have found his way round by the Cape. Of that even we cannot be sure, since he usually succeeded in what other people thought to be impossible. He only reigned for 13 years, and we can never cease to wonder how far the world would have been changed had his life been of the normal span. When his third city in the new province was well on its way, he sailed down the right branch of the Indus, the Bugar, to the sea. At a certain point, natives with primitive notions informed the Macedonians that if they sailed on for 3 days, they would come to bitter water which spoiled sweet water, and thus they knew that the ocean was near. Most of the inhabitants fled far away, and Alexander could not even find a pilot, while a storm damaged nearly all his vessels. He was forced to send troops into the interior to capture some Indians to guide them out of the river, and finally the Macedonian fleet anchored in the last roadstead before the open sea. The Aegean, with its many islands and consequent cross-currents, can be as rough as the ocean, so it was not on account of its tossing that the Greeks looked forward to their coming experience with dread. Besides its supernatural terrors, the limitless character of the ocean appalled them. Moreover, as they came to the mouth of the Indus, they were alarmed by the phenomena of the tide, of which they knew nothing. The water came in and out like a living thing, softly raising the ships anchored on the mud, but doing serious damage to those on hard ground. After the first attack and retreat, soldiers were placed to give warning if it should happen again, and preparations were eventually made on the strength of the ocean's regular hours. Alexander again made solemn offerings to these gods, to whom, he said, Amen had bid him render especial honor, and sailed out to inspect and to perform his priestly duties. On the open ocean, for the first time in his life, he sacrificed to Poseidon, and cast the golden goblet and bowls used for the libation into the sea as an offering for the safety of the fleet, which he was sending thence to the Persian Gulf on an errand of discovery of the utmost importance to his future schemes, and perhaps little thought to see again. Then he returned to the shore. Nearchus, his childhood's friend, was to command the fleet, while Alexander marched along the desolate shores of the Mekron, an infinitely more foolhardy journey in modern eyes. Digging wells and leaving stores of food for the sailors at various points of the coast, Nearchus was compelled to wait for fit weather, as the southerly monsoon was then prevailing, and early in the autumn of 325 B.C. the king bade him farewell, and started on a journey that no European was to make again for over 2,000 years. Indeed, it is thought that it cannot have been quite so dreadful in Alexander's time as it is today, or his army could never have arrived alive at the other end. At first the soldiers were delighted by the myrrh trees, the odoriferous root of nard, and the exotic flowers, and another city of Alexandria was founded among the warlike Oricians. But soon the Macedonians entered a waterless waste. A few fisher folk only were met with in this desolate coast region of Gedrosia. Both Alexander and Nearchus came into contact with the Ichthyopagi, fish-eaters, who lived in huts made of mussel shells, with roofs of the backbones of fishes. A whale offered great architectural possibilities to these simple briny people. They discovered that its jawbones made a perfect pointed doorway. Their drink was sea-water filtered through gravel. The army became gradually more and more wretched, while all their king seemed to think of was catering for the fleet. They came one day to some settlement in the waste, with fields of corn standing round it, and these were harvested for Nearchus and sent with sheep and dates, all fastened together and sealed with the king's seal, to the waterside, to await the ships. So hungry were the soldiers, however, that they broke the seals and fed, nor did Alexander, when he came to hear of it, dream of punishing them, for he knew that only despair had led them to do it. No army had ever passed by this route before, unless it was that of Cyrus, said to have been destroyed in an attempt to traverse southern Gedrosa, and the legendary Semiramis had gone this way when she had fled from India. Nothing that the army had undergone before came up to its sufferings here. The heat and drought destroyed the greater part of it, and most of the beasts of burden. The scorching sand being intolerable, the marches were usually made in the night time, but owing to the scarcity of water, they were often of inordinate length, and had sometimes to be continued during the day. The soldiers in their hunger sometimes killed the beasts of burden for food, and then lied about it. Then, for lack of animals to carry them, the sick had to be abandoned on the route, and no one was left to tend them, as the safety of the whole army was at stake. Those whom they deserted cursed them as they went, and all their precious objects, one with blood, had to be dropped on the desert. When they found water, many of them drank themselves to death. Looking back in after days, this journey seemed like some terrible nightmare. It was in the Mekron that Alexander performed one of the most notably generous acts of his life, and it was seldom that he was not ready to make some generous sacrifice for a friend. He cared so much for big things that he was more ready than St. Martin to give away merely personal possessions, and would take a wonderful amount of trouble to do some little service for anybody. He was now leading his army on foot so as to encourage the infantry, and was in great distress from thirst, when some soldiers came running up with a little water which they had collected in a helmet from an exhausted spring. In the sight of the whole army, looking at him with wolfish faces, the king poured out the water on the ground, and the army felt as refreshed as though each man had received a draught of it. The whole route, however, was strewn with their dead bodies, the pest coming to the aid of hunger and thirst. One night the swelling of a brook swept away most of the women and children who followed the camp. One awful day arrived when the guides confessed that they had lost trace of the route, and Alexander made for the left without knowing how far he might be from the sea. Advancing with a few horsemen, he soon came to the coast, where he found some fresh water, and the guides were again familiar with the way. At Pura, the capital of Gedrosia, the army arrived in the late autumn of 325 B.C., and rested and refreshed itself, its fearful labors now indeed over. Here Alexander came again into touch with the West, which he had left so long ago. Viceroys and generals with their armies arrived from the various satrapies of Asia to pay their court and bring the king fresh supplies and troops. Accusations of tyranny and extortion flowed in against these viceroys, and those against whom wrongdoing was proved were put to death. For Alexander was determined that the conquered races should be contented under his rule. He heard also that one of the governors whom he had left in India had been murdered by the natives, but that the rising had been put down. Through Kierman, by a route of about 400 miles in length, the Macedonian army now proceeded in a very different fashion from that in which it had painfully crossed Gedrosia. Ptolemy and Aristobulus, the two best historians of that period, made no mention of Bacchic revelry, but tradition said that Alexander and his friends lay prone in richly bedizened coaches. The soldiery, merry with wine, like the officers, played the flute and danced along in garlands, while the towns through which this Dionysiac procession passed wore the gayest decorations. Craterus met the party, and soon they entered the home province of Persis. Susa was still 500 miles away, but the Macedonians might consider that they were back once more in the realms of civilization. In Persis, Alexander found that revolts had broken out, and the execution of a few magnates were necessary. At Pasargarte, the king was angered by the damage done to the tomb of Cyrus, whom after Achilles he honored. Guarded by magi, Cyrus lay buried in a golden coffin, with purple raiment and precious stones piled on a rich couch in the tomb, but the tomb had been pillaged, and the corpse cast out of the coffin. Torture extracted from the magi no information as to the malefactors, and Alexander was forced to content himself with commissioning Aristobulus to restore his hero's grave. He caused the old inscription to be cut again in Greek characters below the old one. It ran, "O man, whosoever thou art, and from whencesoever thou comest, for I know thou wilt come. I am Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire. Do not grudge me this little earth that covers my body." The ruins of this simple edifice are still to be seen on the plain of Murjab, where a winged effigy of Cyrus exists on one of the pillars. The viceroy of Persis was hanged, and the valiant and faithful Piusestus was made viceroy in his stead. Piusestus, even better than Hephaestion, understood and liked the Persians. He preferred the Median to the Greek dress, and spoke Persian like a native. As the king approached his capital, Harpalus, the treasurer, fled, hiring a band of 6,000 soldiers and taking with him to Greece, where he thought he would be safest from Alexander, 5,000 talents of the public money left in his charge. From Pasargadae and Persepolis, Alexander went on to Susa, where he arrived in the spring of 324 B.C. Nearchus, meanwhile, had set sail from the mouth of the Indus in October, and hugged the shore, landing at various places along the coast, and suffering severely from lack of water and provisions, but keeping in touch with Alexander, and arriving safely at the journey's end, although he narrowly escaped missing the Persian Gulf and passing out of Ken down the coast of Africa. He landed at the fertile Ormuz, Harmozea, and dirty and starving, his men were rejoicing in the fruits of the earth when they met a Greek who proved to be one of Alexander's soldiers. Nearchus and Archias, in their rags, went inland to visit the king, who could scarcely recognize them, and was overjoyed at the success of a voyage to which he attached so much importance. Among other things, he would be able to avoid many of the terrible land marches which were so costly in lives in future. He warmly commended the fleet, and bade it continue its course along the Persian Gulf and up the river to Susa, a task which Nearchus successfully accomplished. End of chapter 11.